Angel Gurría is the Secretary General of the OECD and joins us now with more on his organization's economic outlook. Thanks for being with us as always. And maybe we can drill into the Canadian story, Angel, just in terms of what you see, these two scenarios you've outlined for 2020.
Well, like everywhere else, it's a sea of red for 2020, some recovery in 2021, but not enough to go above the level of 2019. It's that bad, and it's going to be a tough rowing and working and applauding, whatever it is. It's going to be tough for the next 18 months because we believe that the recovery is going to be like a U-shaped rather than a V-shaped. And one of the reasons is that there's going to be a lot more debt on the books of governments or companies or even households. So therefore, you're going to need a longer runway to take off, more thrust on the engines, and you're going to feel a little heavy on the wings.
And maybe you can dig a little deeper as well into this uncertainty of COVID-19. I mean, it can't be an easy job forecasting at your organization these days when we just don't know what's going to happen with the pandemic. Can you tell us how you factor that in to your estimates?
Yeah. Well, first of all, and let me use the case of Canada. It's an open economy, therefore more vulnerable to everything that is going on right now. But we see that in the case of a second wave, should we have a recurrence of this phenomenon, of course, we'd have to maybe look at confining some sectors, some cities, some areas, whatever, and therefore we would have a second impact that would pile up. So we see this all over the world. That's a scenario which, if it happens, we're factoring in so that we have these two scenarios for the first time ever. Instead of a baseline scenario, we're having these two scenarios looking at the alternatives.
And would it be wrong for me to characterize it as a coin toss? I mean, is one any more than the other? I mean, what's the line in the sand on whether the contraction is, as significant as you think, or even more significant in those two outlines you provided?
I think that a coin toss sounds like a little frivolous, like we're playing with people's lives. We're talking about trillions and trillions of impact all over the world, both in terms of the costs to the economy, but also in terms of the amounts that have been injected in the economy so far. And what we really do not know is whether there would be a recurrence. We don't know enough about the virus itself. There isn't a medicine. There isn't a vaccine. So what we're saying is, let's be extremely prudent in the way we are looking at forecasting, looking at projections going forward, because there may be this possibility. This is what epidemiologists tell us, and it's a 50-50 chance that there may be.
Mr. Gurría, we reported yesterday that the federal government in this country is working towards providing an economic update. They have not publicly talked about that yet, however, and the Prime Minister, in taking questions from the media, played down the idea of working off a fiscal forecast right now. He described it as an exercise in invention and imagination. Can you just, from where you sit, give us your sense on how important it is for countries like Canada to be providing fiscal updates right now?
It is very difficult today because, we can't set the numbers and we can't set the deadlines. The virus sets the deadlines, and we can only, do as great an effort as we can in order to control it and to tame it. But again, without a medicine, without a vaccine, we can just, try to avoid the greatest possible damage. And that has been tried already. Confinement has been tried. It had an impact on the economy. But this question, of choosing between lives and livelihoods is a totally false dilemma. We have to fight both. We have to go everything we got, throw everything we got at the virus, and then that will reduce the consequences, the cost of the consequences of the virus itself, meaning like unemployment, but also it will allow us to set the stage better and faster for the recovery. Now, in that concept, or in that context, trying to do projections, economic projections, becomes more and more difficult. I mean, the IMF last April said -3%. We are now saying -6% in the best of the scenarios. The other one is -7.6. This is happening to every single country in the world. Of course, you try, but you have to build those scenarios, and you have to have a lot of ifs, because you don't want to create expectations that may lead people to take wrong decisions.
That all makes a lot of sense, and I guess I'm just trying to figure out, and obviously the Prime Minister wasn't talking about anything the OECD is forecasting, but his wording yesterday when it comes to forecasting being an exercise in invention and imagination, I would assume from your perspective that the OECD, while you're doing a lot of ifs and ands in the forecasting, that you wouldn't characterize the work you're doing as inventions and imagination.
Well, no, actually it's modeling, it's assumptions, it's some basic fundamentals that we're applying to the work. But please, we have put numbers in there. We put out an economic outlook today that says -8% for the 2020 and -9.4. Were there a second wave? But it also says positive uptick in 2021 in both scenarios. So basically, you have these ranges within which you're going to be moving. And by the way, there are ranges within which practically every single country in the world is moving, because this is the single most global, not only more serious and more dire crisis we've ever encountered in a lifetime, but it's also the most global. It affects practically every single country in the world, and in some cases, it's still developing. In the Americas, in Latin America, for example, in Africa, in some places in Asia, it's still happening, and it's not going to be declared finished until it is finished everywhere else, because we have seen how fast this can just spread all over the place.
And Mr. Gurría, I would imagine that later today, the U.S. Federal Reserve will address some of those issues. Obviously, we have seen a lot of support from central banks like the U.S. Federal Reserve. It did feel like in presenting your outlook today that you were calling on governments to also continue with fiscal stimulus. We've seen an awful lot of it in this country, and based on the backdrop you have laid out for us, that you think pulling out of some of those aid measures too soon could cause greater economic damage. Is that a fair assumption?
Absolutely. I think you got it right. Last time in the crisis, 2008, 2009, we went back to consolidation. We went back to austerity too soon, too fast. And we need to learn from those mistakes.